And let's get started. And I am going to share my screen here. And do this. Okay. So today's topic is winter harvest, extending your growing season. So the idea here is that we are typically thinking of our growing season. Usually people get going in March or April, usually April, but sometimes we can get things started as soon as March, and get some cool season crops in that time of year. And then usually people are closing down their gardens in sometime in October, maybe. So that's kind of the traditional growing season. Some people don't even get their gardens growing till as late as I think a long-standing tradition for I know for like with my grandfather would always put his entire garden in um, at the end of May, Memorial Day weekend. Um, so and that's based on a couple things, that being able to start in the spring. What we are looking for is the day lengths to be long enough, the soil to be thawed and not soggy wet with the cold rains or the snow. So that's the kind of the earliest time that we could think about getting things in the ground. So let's kind of click to the next slide here. I have a question from, before I move on. Stama, do you need a verbal permission, or is there something on Zoom that I need to do to allow you to record? I am actually recording this video, which we can share with folks. We usually put them up on YouTube. But if you want to record the sound, that's fine with me. So if you just clarify on that. Okay, so moving on. So this is a quote that I really like, from Elliot Coleman. Elliot Coleman is one of the innovators of extending the growing season, or growing crops during off-season months. He has his farm out in Maine, and he's getting up there in years these days, but he's brought a lot of knowledge and inspiration to this concept of season extension. And he's got this really wonderful quote: "To make a real difference in creating a local food system, local growers need to be able to continue supplying fresh food through the winter months," which totally applies here in Michigan, "and to do that without markedly increasing our expenses or our consumption of non-renewable resources." So that's where, what I'm going to be kind of going into detail about today is going to be really useful. Okay, great. So we're good with STEM. Okay. Yeah, so this is really a great, concept, because it's, this whole movement, what Keep Growing Detroit is all about is supporting Detroiters growing their own food and having access to fresh local food as much as possible. And this tool is a really powerful tool to be able to help us do that. Or these two, not just this tool, this concept, this kind of way of growing. And I'll start by saying, It's not easy. It's different than growing in our traditional growing season. It takes some trial and error, but we'll talk through um, some crops to definitely try, and things that might be slightly more challenging, and kind of take it from there. So this slide here is just to give you a bigger picture on ways we could and some kind of brainstorming ideas about how we can play around with having produce extend our growing season. This is something that John Bierenbaum, our often teacher with us and friend of Keep Growing Detroit, had put together, who works at MSU. He's actually getting ready to retire this year. But in any case, there's some ideas here that to play around with. So, we're going to be getting into things related to protection and the preservation. Well, not preservation so much, but that's another way of thinking about season extension by taking things like, the tomatoes that we're growing in our fields now and preserving them, whether that be by freezing or by canning, pickling. Not that you would pickle tomatoes. I guess you could pickle green tomatoes, but pickling other things for use down the road. And a note here, I'm gonna, I'm clicking through these slides. Some of them are really useful reference tools, and some may take some more time for you to ponder. But we will make sure that we share the slides as well as the link for the video once that stuff is up. Okay. All right. So moving on. Come on. Okay. So defining season extension. So essentially, we're talking about extending, cultivating these crops beyond their normal outdoor growing season. And a lot of that has to do with controlling temperature. We don't really have control of sunlight. And though we can grow things under lights, any kind of, and this kind of gets to one of the questions that was in the chat here, is that we're going to get into sunlight a little bit more, but essentially, if we're trying to grow under lights, you can use a standard like shop light or simple lighting in your house to get plants started, or to grow things like, microgreens, or on to some degree salad mix that's, only is really intended to be harvested when they're small in size, baby in size. But if we're really trying to grow things to a mature size, that light is just not strong enough. In a basement situation, there are, more systems coming out these days that are accessible to home gardeners or people on a smaller scale that are, that are reasonably becoming more and more reasonably inexpensive. I don't have much experience with LED lights, but that is a new thing, something to explore. But I guess generally speaking, for indoor growing, on a scale of harvested crops takes a bit of an investment for proper lighting, and at that point you probably have to think about ventilation and things of that sort. So it may not generally be advisable, other than starting transplants indoors, for the smaller scale. And if there's more questions on that, we can kind of get into it more a little bit later at the end. I'll try and reserve some time for questions. But essentially, the advantages is this is more of a from a perspective of farmers, but as we were kind of mentioning in that quote from Elliot Coleman, it's being able to have fresh produce, you know, beyond that October timeframe is probably the biggest one. Um, but there is a little bit of investment in some kind of protection materials. We'll get into the details of that. And it is a little bit more work. It's fun to play around with. I really want to encourage everybody who's on the Zoom today to give this a try. I'll get into some of the crops in specific, but spinach is for sure the crown prince, so to speak, of season extension. It prefers to germinate in cool temperatures. It does really well with minimal protection outdoors, and it actually tastes a lot. It tastes amazing. It tastes 10 times better than, warmer season spinach. And we'll talk about why that is a little bit later too. All right, so let's just keep going down the line here. So generally speaking, there are three basic components of season extension. There is so at this time of year in particular is what I'm referring to. So I'm trying to prime you at this point for extending your growing season into the fall and spring. You can also use some of these concepts to be starting crops earlier in the season. And it's, we'll kind of get into the nitty gritty of it. So I'm just going to leave it at that. But at this point, we're looking to grow cold hardy vegetables, and we'll get, and then we are talking about succession planting, or not just considering that you plant just once in, say, like I had mentioned earlier, Memorial Day weekend, my grandfather would plant the whole garden and that was that. You can get a lot more out of your garden if you're thinking about, well, if I grow radishes are only 25 days to harvest. So what am I going to grow right after those radishes? And so when those radishes come out of the ground, then that space is open and you can move on to growing something else. And then protected cultivation is essentially anything from ranging from, using some kind of mulch to quick hoops, or some kind of greenhouse, or low tunnel or high tunnel, hoop house. All those things are ways of protecting the crops. So this is getting into a little bit more detail on that last slide. We're going to get into crops in depth coming up, so I'll just leave it at that. Leafing crops and rooting crops are, as a general rule, those are the crops that are cold tolerant. So, if you wouldn't want to be planting anything that is fruiting at this point. So no tomatoes, eggplant, peppers, melons, squashes, cucumbers, okra, beans, all those types of things really need the warm weather to thrive and to grow properly. You can, and I think that, as we were talked, a little bit with some folks earlier, Candace was talking about pulling out her squash. It's clear that, like, as the cooler temperatures settle in, that those crops will start to senesce. Will start to look kind of, not so happy and dried up, and they just start to crap out essentially, because they really, we're having some nights of 45, and even this weekend maybe 39 degree temps, and so that's something that we know that it's time to get ready to plant the next thing. The growing season is not over. So You know, this is a slide that kind of summarizes the whole picture really well, I think. And that is, you know, plant cold color crops, get them established before day lengths dip below 10 hours, adds protection, and then you know, and then basically we got to get on to harvesting them in various stages based on the particular crops and how much cold they can actually take. So essentially, the reason that we can't grow crops or we aren't, you know, this concept is, you know, kind of trying to push the boundaries of growing, traditional growing, is that um, crops need 10 hours of sunlight to be actively growing. So we got the longest day of the year in June 21st. And then the day, you know, the hours are slowly tapering off. You know, at this time of year, it's September is, you know, roughly 12 hours a day of sunlight. And every day we lose a few minutes, and it ultimately, by about the beginning of November, um, then we're dipping below 10 hours a day. And in addition, the temperatures are cooler. And so those crops, nothing that has been that would be planted after that point isn't going to do much. It will, they kind of grow kind of sort of a little bit. They very slowly, but essentially for all intents and purposes, you know, after that point, we're not going to get things to be actively growing, even if we have a really warm fall. A note there, though, is that you could, you know, if that, you know, if things shake out that it's getting close to that time, and you get a nice warm day, and you are out working in the garden, closing things down, and you have an opportunity to plant a space that would work out really well, to get some protection on, you could set things up to maybe get germinated and then kind of hang out for the winter. And then once the day lengths start to get long enough again in February, then we're looking at, you know, the day lengths getting longer than 10 hours a day at that point. And, um, and so those plants will start to actively grow again. So it really is a really useful tool, because that's not always a convenient time to get out in the garden. It's just the seeds are out there, they're set, and you know, as soon as the day lengths get, you know, there's a little bit of warmth, and we get some good sunny days and everything, you might get some, you know, an earlier jump on things, if you would have otherwise. If you tried to get out there in February and try to get things planted, you may not be as successful, because the germination is a little bit of a hump to get over and everything. So let's see if I want to reference anything else on this slide. My cat's jumping on the table here. Come on. We're going to get into detail on the protection and the crops too. And just, I guess, just to say that, you know, some of these crops will do well and can hang on all through the winter, even in the toughest cold temps. And some things, we're getting them harvested. We're getting them set up to be harvested before, you know, we start to experience, you know, the really cold temps, like in January. And with climate change, who knows, you know, it doesn't seem like we're getting much snow before the end of the year these days. And so, you know, we may have actually a little bit of better luck in that regard. So anyways, moving forward. Cold, hardy vegetables. These are the general categories: leafing or cooking greens, heading greens, root crops, and then baby leaf salad greens. So the baby leaf is something that you would plant densely and harvest it when it's really short, like a salad mix that you get in a little clear plastic box at the grocery store. Okay, so these next two slides these are just some crops that, and a reference. This is from the Johnny Seeds website. Um, this is uh, this is definitely not a comprehensive list of the things that we can grow, and some of these things are not very, you may not have heard of before, like Claytonia. But it's a list it's just a general reference point. Um, so uh, I want to reference here that this is a really good, useful tool for just getting a general idea of when we're trying to get these things in the ground by, you know. So it's getting to be even a little bit late in the season to get some of these things in the ground. But like I said earlier, even if you planted, say, you know, um, carrots, for example, which is on the next slide, um, ideally was planted back in July. Crazy enough, you're planting carrots to be harvesting carrots in the middle of July to be harvesting during the winter, but that's how it shakes out. But at the top there is a reference of dates, and the last column is when, like I had mentioned earlier, November 1st is when the day lengths get shorter than 10 hours. And so this is basically a working backwards calendar of general planting dates for these varied crops. Okay, so we're still in really good shape to be planting radishes and Swiss chard and baby lettuce. I'm sorry, baby Swiss chard and baby lettuce, and some of the Asian greens like mizuna and baby arugula. Um, so let me go back. Yes, and definitely spinach. I'm going to say spinach a million times because I really want you guys to try it out. Cilantro is another one, bok choy, wild arugula, etc. Um, so that's basically, you know, what is the realistic date to work backwards from. And if you don't have this to this these templates to reference on hand, it's essentially, if you say, okay, well, I want to plant some radishes, and I look at the seed packet, and the seed packet on the radishes says 25 days to harvest. So I know that I need to get these established somewhere somewhere in the neighborhood of a month, the beginning of October, roughly a month before, 25 days, roughly a month. November 1st is that 10-hour touch point. A month before that, October 1st, would be kind of the last window that I could realistically get those up to size. And just a note here is that you don't have to, it doesn't mean that you have to harvest all those things by November 1st. It's more of it's more of getting them grown enough, established. And then part of the magic of season extension is that you could, once the colder temps really slow the plants down. So any worries about bolting or just things getting old and tough kind of diminish. There is some worry about freezing or heavy freezing, but these crops will kind of hang out. It's basically like there's a refrigerator out in your yard that you can go out and pick the stuff out of the refrigerator, but it's fresh. It's like fresh instead of you can't um, harvest spinach this week and 3 weeks later it's going to be in your fridge and it's still going to be good. No, it's not. It doesn't work that way. So there's a question here. What does established mean then? Since you are talking about planting radishes based on the time to harvest, but if I want to harvest radishes later, can I plant them later? No, because they're not going to be actively growing after that point. So you could be harvesting those radishes. Like basically, like I'm saying here, is that um, like it's this refrigerator situation that they're established, and then you have a window of, I think in the case of radishes, they're slightly tender, so you probably have through the end of November, um, maybe into December, based on how weather is here, to still harvest. So that would be kind of temperature dependent on some level. And again, we've been having slightly warmer winters, or at least the end of the year. Um, but yeah, you have that window to be able to, and then some things, if carrots are established, the carrots will sit there all winter long. Spinach is another one, sit there all winter long. And some of these Asian greens like Mizuna will sit there all winter long until you go out there and harvest it. It'll kind of hang out there. And it will, these things will freeze. And like I said, some of them can tolerate freezing, and they get them come out of that freezing good and do well. Some things that and growing vegetables, I always like to say that growing vegetables is like getting to know your neighbors or your family, or getting to know people. Like each one has got its own characteristics. You get to know that um, their personality traits and their quirks. So you kind of you got to try things out. You'll notice that some things are more successful than others, and they break things down here, as as you can see at the bottom of the page, that they have it set up in 3 tiers, where most reliably successful, second most dependable, some things are kind of more challenging to grow. But I don't want that to discourage you, but if you do try those things that maybe it would be, and it didn't work great, then well, okay, then maybe it was because it was a tier 3, and just try again, essentially. I do want to mention here that what I mentioned earlier about the spinach and this also applies to carrots. I think it applies to a lot of these things. Um, there's a natural tendency for some of these crops to, as a response to colder temperatures, to pull up sugars out of the soil into the plant, because it acts as a natural antifreeze. Um, so you get the benefit of that by, you get, the carrots, winter carrots are so much sweeter. Well, winter spinach, sweeter, a lot of nosh and minutia, mizuna, all those, the flavor of winter greens is much, much better than any other time of the year. Um, so let me see if I'm hitting on, I'm going to check in on the chat on some of the things that were asked earlier. Okay. Candace, we can talk about doors at, either offline, or if you have a particular question, if you'd like. I definitely have some recommendations. It would be contingent upon, what specifically kind of house that you're working with. Um, all right. So, and we'll kind of talk about keeping crops warm. And Lois, I feel like I answered your question there. Yes, can you share a link to the website that has this diagram? Um, I not directly right now without having to jump around on the internet, but if you go to the Johnny Seeds website and you look up season extension, or I think it might even be planting dates for this title at the top, planting dates for winter harvest crops, in their search box for their under their education materials, that'll get you there. There was a hand raised. Make sure that everybody's getting in here. Hold on 1 second, okay, guys. All good? I saw a hand raised. Uh, okay. Well, I think I need to keep going. That looks right. Thanks. That looks like the right link there. I have types of spinach from KGD. Question here. I have types of spinach seed from KGD. Are all a pretty sure bet for planting success? Well, um, I would say generally yes. If you like, there are some varieties that they say are better performers for colder temps. Spinach in general is going to still be, use what you got, I would say, for now, but you could definitely shop around, get a Johnny's catalog, or get a High Mowing catalog, or any one of the seed companies. And even they usually even have a section on season extension. There, there is a lot of resources, particularly on the Johnny's website. So Johnny Seed's website is definitely worth checking out. So kind of referencing heat and temperature, um, we are, with this philosophy, with this kind of approach to growing, the concept is to plant things that can tolerate cold and give them a little bit of protection. And using some of the structures will actually, the plastic or the row cover or the greenhouse or whatever helps retain heat, so that, will help them perform better. The bigger structures have the more ability to retain heat. So what would happen is the heat of the day, the sunlight that comes through in an unheated structure with, no utilities whatsoever, on a warm day, like say it's 32 degrees out and it's sunny, it'll be 50 or 60 degrees inside just from the sunlight, and the sunlight heating up the air, and to some degree the sunlight heating up the dark soil, because it absorbs more heat, and then that also in turn, that warmed soil from the daytime will radiate that heat during the winter, which is also of benefit to those plants. So the bigger the structures, the better that the plants will perform, but also the more of a capital investment, the more you have to pay to get one of these larger structures in. We'll talk about costing a little bit later too. Okay, so moving on. This is a reference chart for rotating crops in hoop houses. I kind of generally want to just disregard the title. What I want you to focus on is these categories, because I think this is a really useful way of thinking about crops in general. And this relates to, this relates, especially if you're getting into planting a larger garden. And it also relates really well to succession planting. Essentially, you could categorize, and this is just focusing on, a certain selection of crops that are, specific for, a lot of people grow in hoop houses. So this could be, broken out more into other crops for the general growing season. But if you start to think about crops in these types of categories, where some things are grown, basically put in the ground, and they have a long residency. So kale and collards are a classic example of that. So, you could plant them in April, and many people do. I still have kale and collards in my yard from April, and it's still doing great. I'm still harvesting. I'm still harvesting those collards and kale. So they can keep going and going and going. And then some things are kind of a short residency, or like that you're intending to grow them and they have a short growing season. So this is just the idea of playing around with, the crops that you want to grow and the amount of time that they're, in the ground and what's going to follow that afterwards. So, if it's a late season, long residency crop, then you might not be planting until late spring to get the most benefit out of that crop. Whereas if it's a late season, short residency crop, then, you're planting, getting a harvest through the winter, and then you're, trying to get another planting in potentially in the spring. And that's not all set in stone. It's just food for thought. Yeah, I see there's Ella, you're saying, about the dates. I looked at that. It's really a matter of minutes, that it's like 10 hours and 15 minutes on November 1st, and then November 8th and 9th are, a true 10 hours, and that's why I just decided to go with that. We're talking about planting things to get them established. Looks like this week would be one of the last weeks for spinach, for example. Are you talking about growing from seed or from started plants? Growing from seed. And, I guess going back to those slides, I think that you could push those boundaries. All this stuff, don't think of it as set in stone. And truth be told, I was hoping to have this class a little bit earlier in the season, but the way that the cards shook out about when we were able to schedule it, it was this week. So yeah, I know this probably information might have been a little bit more benefit to you guys, a few weeks ago. But, I think that these concepts you can still get things growing for this season and use this information for the spring as well. So apologies for that, but there, I would definitely, even, from seed, start spinach directly in the ground. Okay, moving on. So just spending a little bit of time, getting just looking at these crops. Some of these things, I'm sure you are very familiar with, and others you may be slightly less so. So top left is spinach, and then looks like and then there's collards, and then beet greens. So those are thinnings from beets. Chard would be similar. And then mustard greens, colored variety, variegated variety, chard at the bottom, and kale. I guess this is a bunching spinach of some sort at the top left next to the spinach. The collards is the bottom right for sure. And then let's see, moving on. And these are some examples of headers. So we got heading lettuces, a few varieties, some Boston Bib, and some red leaf. These are bok choys. So I know bok choy may be new to some people, or like they not, I know like it's sometimes not quite clear when you're supposed to harvest things, but they tend to be, a lot of them tend to be, slightly smaller than you might expect, compared to like some of the bigger greens like collards and kale. So we're really harvesting these when they're like, 8 to 12 inches tall. Depends on the variety, but just to note that like, these are, this gives you a kind of an idea of the picture. Some Napa cabbage, and so on. Rooting crops. So these are probably the 4 best performing rooting crops. And to be totally clear, we generalize the categories of of leafing crops and rooting crops, but some root crops for sure do not work well. For example, sweet potatoes is a heat-loving crop, does not do well in the cold temps. It will absolutely turn to mush once it gets cold. Another potatoes, which is in the solanaceous or tomato family, does not like cold temps. Um, or freezing temps. So you can start them early enough in the spring, but they don't like it when it gets super cold. Of note here, so we got the radishes. There's lots of varieties. There's some varieties of radishes that tend to be slightly better performers. This looks like an Easter egg radish up top here. Any of the ones that are going to be like, you don't want to go for the big long day varieties. You want something that's kind of the shorter day varieties and tend to be slightly smaller. As a general rule, and this is just like, my battery is running low. Let me just run and make sure I plug this in before we have any issues. Give me 1 second. I'm back. And I do that. Okay, power on. I'm starting to say that, generally speaking, I'm giving lots of generals, I'm just going to say this thought. Younger growth is more tender and more tolerant of freezing temperatures. So, and then more older, more mature growth, like that kale plant that has been growing in my garden all season, has lots of lignins in it, which make the cell walls really rigid. So things that are high in water or have lots of lignins are prone to damage when we have freezing temperatures. Carrots seem to be an exception in this way, the way that so like the way that they compartmentalize, or the way that they form themselves, they do just fine. They do terrific, actually. But some of these things, like lettuce, for example, it'll do it. It is definitely in this category of crops that we're talking about here, but it does, once we start to get some solid freezing temps, it'll tend to peter out. So that would be like something that you're intending to harvest, later in November and into December. This one on the top right might be slightly less familiar to people. These are Japanese turnips. Hakurai turnip is one of the rye. Salad turnip is another term that they use for them. They tend to be slightly smaller than our traditional like purple top turnips or the green turnips that we grow for greens. And they tend to be more mild and definitely not as spicy as some turnips can tend to be. So that's one to look out for, and it's a really good performer. Beets are great, carrots are great. Okay, Okay, so question here. What would be the latest harvest time or temp for sweet potatoes? Um, so we, basically we're trying to let sweet potatoes go as long as possible um, without them getting hit by the frost. So if you see any frost warnings out there, um, that's not, we probably won't start to see those for at least another month, I would think, um, that you want to get them out before then. But they're still going strong. So keep those going. Let's make sure. Okay. All right. Moving on. This is Jerry and Billy over at Oakland Ave Urban Farm harvesting radishes a few years back. This is just a picture of some radishes in the field just for visual reference. And what I want to talk about is this is a perfect kind of segue, right? Great. This is what I want to talk about next. So baby leaf salad greens, this is also kind of, it's a general category. There's lots of colors and shapes and textures, as you can see in this slide here. And it's something kind of referencing what I was just talking about a few minutes ago, is that these are young growth. They just tend to hold up well to the colder temps. And particularly some of the Asian green varieties, like this Mizuna in the middle, which is like, basically there's lots of them. This one up here in the top right is another cousin of the one in the middle, and a cousin of the one down to the left. I think that's arugula down to the left. They are all in the mustard family, which are kind of cousins of collards and kale and the brassicas. And they'll fare slightly better than things like the lettuce up in the upper left. And then, you could be growing beet greens in a similar way down to the right, and these are things that are essentially, you're planting really densely with the intention of not letting them get much larger than 6 inches at most. So this looks like beet greens or spinach. Harvesting. Miss Floyd harvesting. You can see the snow outside, and she's got the crops. She's pulling some stuff out of the ground there. Some lettuce, looks like, based on that tag. That was a few years ago. Boy. Okay, another one, lettuce. This is a really nice stand of spinach. Again, just for some visual reference. Okay, so, and this is a picture of the Mizuna. Other varieties of Asian greens. I'm gonna skip over this warm season stuff for right. Back. Skip over the warm season stuff for right now. I guess I would just, in general, like if you're excited about trying, you like salad, there are many varieties in coming out, and they're all pretty and like have different colors. You can kind of get real, you can get really creative with it, with planting different types of stuff in this, in the Asian green, the general Asian greens category. And all the seed companies have these in spades these days. So check out that stuff. And if you really are looking for more references, I'll share my email at the end. We can talk. Okay. Okay. The next kind of key leg in the pillar or in the stool of succession planting is timing, which we talked about a little bit. We kind of went over this already, but just to reference again, I want to show you guys this. if you've been in my classes before, you've probably seen this because I like to share it. I think it's not the perfect tool, but um, it's a really useful tool for planning out your garden. I will happily share it with you on Excel. But if you essentially what we're looking at here is because of the way that the format of the color background in these slides, it's a little bit confusing, but I think you guys can see my pointer. But each of these blocks here represent a 4x8 raised bed broken up into 4 sections. And this is getting really technical on just 3 little raised beds. This type of planning really is intended for for a larger scale. I will definitely share the template in the email when I share out the video and the slides. So the concept here is that the columns at the top represents the weeks in the year. Okay, so each week, there's the first week in January, second week in January, so on and so forth. And so we can say, okay, I know that I'm going to plant head lettuce in 1A in this section in the beginning of April, and head lettuce is about 50 days, 60 days, and I should be harvesting it by somewhere close to the end of May, and that spot's going to be open again, so I'm going to be prepared and have my calendar or have this chart on my refrigerator or something, so I see it every day as a reminder, and I'm like, oh yeah, and then I maybe in this case I did a little gap and let it warm up a little bit in the season, and then I planted some bush beans there, and I'm going to be I was harvesting them, probably started harvesting them by the middle of July, and by the end of July maybe they're starting to wane, and then I'm going to try and get ready for my next planting of spinach in that same space, and so on and so forth. Some things like we were talking about earlier with the long residency, like tomatoes are going to be harvested on and on and on. And it's at this point, especially if you have limited space, this point in the season is a hard call. Like we are essentially at our farm, we could still be harvesting tomatoes for easily another couple weeks, but as much as a month. But we're pulling out half of the, most of the houses planted in tomatoes, and we're pulling out, like Helen and I pulled out about half of them today because we're trying to get our fall crops, our winter crops in, essentially. So there you have it. So that's just talking about succession, and I'm going to click that. And then protected cultivation. This is a short list of the ways that we could be protecting these things, and they start at the top with kind of the simplest and most cost effective, and then as you get down, they get to be bigger in size, more functional. Excuse me, one second. Okay, I'm in the class, so we'll have to do it later. Okay. Go see Mama. That was June. Let's see. Okay, I want to reference the questions here. Can tomatoes, eggplant, or cukes be grown in an extended season under hoops? Yes, but as I was saying, those things we can extend their conventional growing season. And the concept here is that we are extending their conventional growing season, but the reality is those things do not like cold whatsoever. So like I was just referencing, that, we could be getting another month or more out of our tomatoes. Well, maybe another month, which is longer than, like, people's tomatoes are probably starting to peter out in the next 2 weeks, especially when we get this cool weather this weekend. We're going to start to see those tomatoes not looking so happy, and it's maybe time to pull them off the vine and start to ripen those fruit off of the vine. And definitely you can also use those hoops to start things like tomatoes earlier. And that's one thing that people with these structures, is a classic strategy, is that you would start tomatoes earlier in those structures to be able to get a harvest earlier. So to be the first at market, or the first amongst your friends to be having tomatoes, as soon as the middle of May, or I'm sorry, the beginning of June. Okay, so we're going to kind of look at these structures in a little more detail, but mulches, when I say mulch, this is something it's kind of a finicky thing to do, because it requires like putting mulch in and around your plants, and harvesting becomes, especially with leafy greens and such, is like not ideal. But this works really well with carrots, for instance, where you get a nice planting of carrots and they're to size and they're basically ready to be harvested, and then you just mulch them really well with a layer that, this kind of insulated layer of straw, ideally. Straw, because it allows the water to penetrate, and it doesn't mat like shredded leaves, and wood chips are just too heavy. So straw is really kind of ideal in this circumstance. And that, and that would allow, and it also buffers the ground from freezing, so you can get out there and harvest when the ground is frozen. So let's look at some pictures. These are, some generalized kind of tiered of these pictures of these different options aside from the mulch, I guess. So quick hoops up to the right. For most home gardeners, I'm sorry, Ella, I'm not sure what you're asking. What'd you miss? Quick hoops are a really, really great tool. And I highly regard this one this is a good beginner setup for growing, for the protection of your plants. It's really, really cost effective. Caterpillar tunnels is kind of an in-between. It's definitely more of an investment, and there's, this is just one example of it. This is like a baby version of, this is like, it's like baby, teenager, and big brother, or, or parent, or whatever, in terms of categories. So quick hoops is the baby, caterpillar tunnel is the teenager, and the Hoophouse is the big boy. Caterpillars, they're 12 to 14 foot wide and about 10 feet tall. There's different sizes and shapes. If you really, and we'll kind of go through some price breakdowns on those. So caterpillar tunnels. This is a picture of some caterpillar tunnels set up at Earthworks Urban Farm. Really nicely done setup. They cost about 50 cents a square foot. There's a couple of different ways that you can put them together. Essentially, you need to get these hoops. So they could be, like referenced here, 1/2-inch EMT conduit, electrical conduit that comes at a standard, they come in 10-foot lengths, and then you just need to bend them. And we have a bender at the Keep Growing Detroit farm. If that's something, essentially you can buy the materials at any hardware store, just about the big box hardware stores, or most local hardware stores will sell the EMT conduit. And if you want to, set something up, you can buy a bender yourself. I think they're $50 or $75, but just as easy, you could, make an appointment with me and we can set a time to figure out a way to do a social distance quick hoop bending. It's pretty relatively easy to do. The material, it's each hoop is like, last time I checked, it was like $3.50 a piece for the metal stuff. You can also get CPVC, and we'll reference that in some slides down the row. It's also used for electrical work, and it's a type of PVC. And those are like flexible, and they can kind of serve the same function. They tend to deteriorate over time. Like the metal conduit will last for 10 years plus. The CPVC is actually a bit cheaper, but you're going to get maybe 2-3 seasons out of them, and they'll start to get, the sunlight will start to break them down. These quick hoops are covered in row cover, and you can get them. You can get the row cover in standard lengths. I'm sorry, I'm trying to read at the same time. You can get the row cover in standard lengths from places like Johnny Seeds, Farm Tech. Unfortunately, there's no place locally that carries this. Maybe Tractor Supply. I've heard people talk about that, but the benefit of the row cover is that it's breathable. So if we get some temperature fluctuations, then, we get a nice sunny day and it's 40 degrees in the spring, if plastic was on that, then it would get pretty warm inside of there. But this will, act as its kind of own little ventilation. So you can either do this with row cover, and then once we get snow, you put plastic on it at that point. Or you could do the plastic itself and just, try and work on a strategy for ventilating it periodically. Definitely is something that requires some time to kind of get your, routine of maintenance with it. This is where the maintenance, at this point, and, with any of these tools, this is the one, it's the least expensive, but it's a little bit finicky, for managing, because you can see here, there's a weight at the bottom of each bow. If we get high winds, definitely that row cover is going to blow around and need something to weigh it down. And so, just the general maintenance on that is a little bit finicky. And the protection and the temperature retention is not as good as some of the bigger structures. There's a note here from Pat Holmes to try Menards for row cover. Never, if any, report back if you know that's a for sure thing. I'm beginning to share with people. Okay. Cold frame is another one. This is classic, kind of old school. And, this is just one design. This is kind of a classic idea, and you can figure out, ways to, and this might be, in some cases, under certain circumstances, a better option for people than the quick hoops, just because it's, maybe it fits better. You could maybe figure out how to do this over your raised beds. Quick hoops actually also do work really well over raised beds. I mentioned that the plastic that you're using for the quick hoops, or if you were using it to make the window for the cold frame here, I recommend that you get a greenhouse plastic, and that would be, again, those two references are probably pretty good sources, would be the Johnny Seeds or Farm Tech, FARMTEK. Because the standard, like painter's tarp plastic, clear plastic, will degrade relatively quickly outdoors in the sunlight. It'll become brittle and kind of make a mess. In a pinch, it'll work, but it's not ideal. This greenhouse stuff will last 4 or 5 years, and it's pretty durable. So it's, you know, a little bit of a hassle to get it, but it's definitely maybe worth the investment. Here's an example of a cold frame made from old shower doors, so you can definitely get creative with it. These are some pictures from Elliot Coleman's farm of some big raised beds that he had set up with these paneled glass windows, and this is his kind of ventilation setup with the sticks holding them up. So okay, this is a handful of years ago. This is probably 6 or 7 years ago. Me and Mr. D setting up some quick hoops with the PVC at his site. So this was when we were using the CPVC, and you can see that they're standing up right there, and that one on the end is one we had bent over. And this is D putting it down. And then this is us putting some cover over it. We were during a class. And another way to get the cover to stay on well is to zigzag rope over the top and then tying it off. It's a good option as an alternative to the bags. A note about the bags for the weights at the bottom of each side of the hoops is, you know, one easy way to do it is just to use some grocery bags and garden soil, or fill them with compost or sand. Ideally, you don't want to use any kind of weights. I know that picture I showed earlier had bricks, but anything that has sharp edges, this row cover stuff does, you know, tear relatively easily. So it's something to keep to note. It's the finished product at Dee's place. Some other examples of the weights on the edges. And this is on a big scale, on a farm scale, where they set the whole thing up with a tractor and they weigh it down with soil along the edges. And then you can also see here that they poked holes in the top for ventilation. So that this is something probably a long season crop where they're just intending to only open these things up. Maybe it was carrots, and they're just kind of they're opening up them, you know, as they're doing a big harvest. But you could play around with this concept of weighing down, say, you know, using soil just to bury one edge of the row cover, and then you only access the hoop from the other side. Next to talk about is the caterpillar tunnel, slightly bigger. They run more like $1.50 to $2 a square foot. So 14-foot by 100-foot structure would be like $1,800 to $2,000. Jump in prices here. Even so, you know, even if you're doing 25 feet, a quarter of that, we're talking $500, you know, some thereabouts to get one of these types of structures set up. This one, I want to make a note. Farmer's Fed or Bootstrap Farm. Those two websites are sell these kits, and there's lots of options on them, and they're really easy. You know, even though they're relatively easy to put together, a lot easier than the bigger structures. And you know, one or two people. Well, two people. I think you definitely need two people, and you don't need many tools. Some kind of, you know, standard drill and sledgehammer and things of that sort. And if you're really getting into these ideas of these larger structures, you can, you know, reach out to me. I can definitely give you more insight into that stuff. Okay. Um, and there's also, you know, you can play around with doing DIY stuff. This is something um, we have a partner organization that does urban gardening stuff in Minnesota, and they were really excited about this concept. So we helped them put together a design, and it helped them build this a few years back. It's actually, it was really cool. There was a young guy there that made a comic book about the whole process, about how to build them. And we took the concept. This is one that um, Bill and Billy Hickey have out in Brightmoor. That's actually, it's small scale and it's movable. Um, but you know, since we did this, this is 5 or 6 years ago or more. Since we did this, these caterpillar tunnels from Farmer's Friend and Bootstrap Farmer have come out, and they make the process a lot easier. You don't have to do all these bends and everything. And I think in terms of cost, it might be comparable or might even be cheaper to go with the Bootstrap Farmer at this point. And this was another design we were playing around with, based on Johnny's Seeds has a bender, and this is similar to what Bootstrap Farmer does. Is you can get some material locally, like this is this hoop here is made out of fence top rail that you could get someplace locally, like Federal Pipe and Supply, 20-foot lengths, and then we actually have a bender. If that's something that interests you, we have a bender for that size of hoop as well. Okay, some pictures of these structures with snow on them. And then to the big guys, which, now we're talking about $4 to $5.50 a square foot. So for a larger structure, 20 by 72, we're talking more like $6 or $7 grand. So that really, if you get into this point, you need to qualify. In my mind, you need to qualify like this kind of investment. So usually at this point, you either have some money to work with that it's not a big deal, or you're trying to make a business out of it and you intend for your business to, your produce sales to pay this off. And there takes some, most in terms of what it takes to build these, it's not rocket science, but, if anybody's got general building skills, has assembled a shed or done any kind of small time construction, you probably could pick up on this pretty easily. Or again, if you're going down this path, reach out. And just a few other, I'll go through a few other slides for reference, and then we'll break it out for questions. Okay. So at this point, this is for these larger structures, having an inner cover for heat retention is always a good idea if you can do it. Like in this picture here, it's almost 80 degrees under that thermometer under these, underneath these, this inner cover. And he's definitely, you can see, probably there's snow outside here, and he's got some winter clothes on there. So beautiful house planted out with varieties of greens and such. There's some innovations with movable tunnels. I'm not going to get into that too much right now. Some spinach, and we'll wrap it up there. Okay, so I think I did a pretty good job of answering your questions while we were going, but now is your opportunity to chime in on your questions. And I'm going to figure out how to go back to full screen here. Stop sharing. There you go. And I'm back. I missed a few questions. Weird. Oh, there's Q&A. So why is there? It's so annoying. There's a Q&A spot and there's a chat spot. So I didn't see that the Q&A was going on. I'm sorry, guys, for those who were there. But going over to the chat, um, you're welcome. I'm glad you guys enjoyed it. Okay, Madison, could you A-frame 2 old windows for a cold frame, or is it better to have the wood base um, to not let as much cold air in? Yeah, you could play around with that. A little bit of gap is fine for it kind of acts as ventilation actually. Um, so if you had like a row of A-framed windows that you connected somehow at the top, I think that's something to play around with. So uh, I don't think I showed an image exactly of it, but you could, if you have a south-facing um, part of your house, if you do it right against your house, if that's a possibility, and it's a good spot that gets sun, then that actually is a really good option because you also are getting some residual heat from the building itself, whether it be brick or whatever, or just like the heat loss of your house. So yeah, play around with that. Susan, if you're still on, it's pretty late to be starting broccoli at this point in the season. I don't know where you would get starts at this time of year. Okay, from Sean, are most fall winter crops the type that don't require pollination? If so, how do you manage pollination? New to gardening, so apologies for the crazy question. No problem. So, the crops that require pollination are, for the most part, fruiting crops. So things that we harvest that have seeds in them. So tomatoes, eggplant, squash, watermelon, cucumbers, beans. Those are the things that require pollination, and those are the things that we're not. In this case, we are not, trying to grow. We're more focused here on leafing and rooting crops that do not require pollinators to grow to be eaten. If we wanted to save seed from them, yes, we would grow them to their maturity and have them flower, and yes, they need to be pollinated to make more seed, but that's separate from the harvesting to eat aspect. Okay. Any other questions? Just a comment. Last year, my row cover blew off, and kale, collards, carrots, spinach survived at North Cast. That's in my raised beds, right? Okay. No. Okay. Yeah. I mean, sometimes they get. It says if the row cover comes off, and they still might be just fine. Okay, so yeah, for Sean again, the question is the reason if I place the tomatoes, cukes eggplant under hoops, as I asked earlier, how do I maintain them until the cold takes over? So so the season is going to end for them. They can't tolerate the cold, is the short answer. So yeah, then you might get them to last a little bit longer, but for this, those quick hoops aren't, I'm assuming that's something that you would be trying to do in the circumstance, and I don't think that's going to help you too much. It's not going to help you get much more out of them. I would say that when they start to look like they're not doing much better, then it's time to dump. All right. Well, thanks for coming out. Super happy to share this information with you guys. We got some more great classes on the horizon. I actually don't remember what one is next. I believe it's a cooking class, but I don't have the details off the top of my head. I'm sorry, I'm unprepared. But it's on our website. So anyways, stay safe out there, and we'll see you soon.